What's up, everybody, and welcome in to another edition of the Sitdown, a Mafia history podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Nadu. Hope you're all having a great day. Hope you had a great 4th of July holiday. I know 4th of July is always a great holiday because it's really the unofficial start of summer. You're kind of ready to go. You're at the pool or you're at the beach or wherever you are. You have some great food, see some people. There's no gifts that have to be given. It's a very laid back day. Weather's generally nice. It's a lot to be thankful for. I hope you all had a great 4th of July. It's a big week for me as well because for 4th of July, it's always big for me because not only do I have 4th of July, but I can look forward to the fact that my birthday is about a week later, July 10th. So it's a big week for me. My birthday will be on Sunday. I'm another year older, which, I think once you get to 30, you start to really dread birthdays because it just means one more year down on your clock. But I'm still pretty young, and I'm sure I'll get some birthday wishes. I thank you all for them. We're going to get right to the show today. And on this show, there's no frills, there's no nonsense. We generally get right into the topic. We've got a huge one today. The person in all 65 episodes we've done, well, actually, we haven't done, and I've gotten asked about most, is today's topic. We're going to talk about the little man, Carlos Marcello. In my estimation, probably, I think, without a doubt, a guy that I think it's hard pressed when you look at the American Mafia. He is arguably the most powerful, richest, most successful mafia figure really in the history of American Cosa Nostra. When most people talk about the mafia, and I'm not talking about historians, I'm not talking about authors, very few will include Carlos Marcello in their Mount Rushmore, if you will. You're always going to hear the Carlo Gambinos or the Lucky Lucianos, and that's fair. But when it comes to power and truly ruling an area, Carlos Marcello literally ruled the South. Him and Santo Trafficante were just powerhouses. It's that simple. This is a guy that in the 60s, as a whole of what he was bringing in revenue-wise, Carlos Marcello was the most successful company in the entire state of Louisiana. Now, keep in mind, he ran the mafia. Keep in mind, in the mid-60s, it was estimated Carlos Marcello was bringing in $2 billion with the B. Now, when we put that into perspective, what that means today, that's, if we're talking about $1 billion in 1965, that's equivalent to, I don't know. When we look at it, it's, let me double check here. I want to say it's about 10 billion. It's incredibly big amounts of money. And it's just something that it's really unimaginable when you think about it. This is a man that had really no education. He barely spoke the language. He was not even a U.S. citizen. Let's get into the story of really the most revered mafia figure ever, a guy that may have been involved with the murder of a president, may have been involved with the murder of a U.S. senator, may have had a connection to the assassination of Martin Luther King. This is a guy that, when it comes down to it, is probably the most politically connected, corrupt individual that this country's ever seen from a mafia standpoint. Let's get into it. Carlos Marcello on the sit-down. Calogero Minicore was born February 6th, 1910, in the North African country of Tunisia. Now, a lot of people are going to wonder, is that factual? Absolutely. Carlos Marcello's family, it was said that they lived in refugee camps or in the area of Tunis in Tunisia for about a year or two. Many Sicilian immigrants would flock to Northern Africa in hopes to eventually head over to the United States. And that's exactly what happened. Ultimately, his parents, Giuseppe and Luigi would actually move from Tunisia into the United States in 1911 when Carlos was an infant. They would travel on a ship called the Liguria, which is a steamship. They were actually from Revenusa in Sicily, which it was a fairly well-known town. Ultimately, the Marcello family would have 8 children. And once coming to America, Carlos's father actually worked on a sugar plantation. And I mentioned at the beginning the name Minicore. That was his birth name. That was his name in Italy. That was the family name. Giuseppe Minicore was his father. Now, interestingly enough, a lot of individuals from Ravenusa and from Sicily actually settled in the same area of New Orleans, in an area, Jefferson Parish. And the individual that ran the sugar plantations name was actually Minicore as well. So to avoid confusion, Carlos's father would actually change his name to Marcello. Now, for the Marcellos, they would be like any other immigrant family. It really didn't matter, whether it was New York or Chicago or New Orleans. New Orleans was a ravishing area for Italians. I mean, about 200,000 Italians would go through New Orleans, and it would end up today being a very Italian area. In fact, Carlos's father, Joe, would save a lot of his money and would ultimately buy a rundown farm in the southeast New Orleans neighborhood of Algiers. During those times, Algiers was actually, like much of New Orleans, fairly run down. Algiers was actually an area that had many African American people living in that area. And it was kind of an area bereft of anything positive. His father would actually own a small bar in Algiers, and he'd actually use his farm to grow fruits and veggies that the family would sell in the French Quarter. In fact, really by 13, 14 years old, Carlos realized that school probably wasn't for him. He would head to Decatur Street in the French Quarter, and they would, alongside their family, sell fruits and veggies. Now, Carlos was the oldest of the children, and for whatever reason, he actually never became a citizen of America, which down the road we'll talk about ended up being a pretty big issue for Carlos Marcello. Marcello by 8th grade would drop out, and he would actually be known around town and really around his small neighborhood as a bit of a leader. He ended up leaving school to kind of go to work, basically. He started pushing fruit carts up the French Quarter. And like many young boys, really, you take umbrage or kind of the thought of you want to look at the older guys around you and what they're doing. And like any kid, when you grew up in an area bereft of anything positive, you're going to slot in with the undesirables. You're going to slot in. If you're hanging out with 5 losers, you're going to be the 6th. And that's exactly what happened to Carlos Marcello. He began hanging around robbers and criminals and gangsters. And before you know it, he starts making money. He becomes a student of crime, if you will. By his late teens, Carlos Marcello's making money. He actually moves by then into the French Quarter. He'd rented an apartment for about $2 a week in those times. And he was able to do his thing. Now, I kind of want to talk a little bit about the landscape of the American Mafia, particularly in New Orleans. And it's really one of the birthplaces of the American Mafia. There's really been a fringe of the New Orleans crime family, really all the way back, to, frankly, in 1860-ish. It ultimately would culminate in the 1890s. A man called Charles Matranga actually would run the family really into the 20s. The Matranga crime family was the known entity in New Orleans. And really, when we look back at kind of the original Charles Matranga family, it was really the earliest recorded crime family in the country. I mean, it wouldn't be until the 1880s when Giuseppe Morello would kind of become someone involved in New York criminality. So really the birth of the American Mafia was actually in New Orleans. Ultimately, the name you'll hear a lot really before Carlos Marcello was a person called Silver Dollar Sam Carolla. He would kind of take over the family from his predecessor. And really take them from kind of a black hand society, an extortion group, to really a mafia group where they had an underboss, they had capos, they had soldiers. And we'll talk more about kind of Carlos Marcello slotting in. Marcello, by his late teens, began kind of taking up a friendship with certain criminals. He, alongside two other individuals, started robbing banks, stores, things of that nature. Carlos Marcello and his friends would actually hit a bank, and then they'd ultimately hit a Chinese grocery store. The problem for Marcello was he wasn't very lucky when it came to getting away with it. By his second robbery, the Chinese grocery, he would actually be caught in 1929 and be arrested for robbery. In 1930, he would ultimately get 9 to 12 years in Angola, which is one of the more notorious prisons in the state of Louisiana. Now, through whether we would call it connections or not, the truth is for many years, the state of Louisiana was a very corrupt place. Now, by this point, Carlos Marcello's father actually had connections, obviously, into, the mafia from in Sicily. And it was said that he would actually band with certain representatives to get Carlos released. He would only serve about 4 years and was released in the mid 1930s. Now, Carlos's father would actually shift a lot of his work ethic to shrimping, actually. By the age of 24, his brothers and him were all obviously kind of creating their own life, but Joe Marcello would actually expand his interest into shrimping. Shrimping had been kind of a big agricultural economy for a lot of people, especially in South Louisiana, particularly with the Italians, as they would, head out in that Gulf of Mexico and really do some really big things on some of those shrimp boats down there. And Carlos's father got into that. But for Carlos, he would use a lot of the money that he had made and kind of saved up. And he'd actually bought a rundown bar for about $500 in a little town outside of Louisiana called Gretna. It was actually part of Jefferson Parish, not far from New Orleans proper. It was a place at 2010 O'Connor Street in Gretna. He would call it the Brown Bomber, and he put his brother Peter in charge of the bar. Now, Gretna was a perfect place for Carlos Marcello because it was a seedy suburb that really kind of was a den of iniquity, if you will. It was where all the undesirables hung out. It was where the drug dens were. It was where the bars were open all hours. It was where they had gambling halls and pool spots and whorehouses. It was a perfect place for a young criminal and a criminal syndicate to run their operations. Now, by this point, the New Orleans crime family was in control by a guy called Silver Dollar Sam Carolla. It's a bit of a tongue twister. Silver Dollar Sam. He was in control, and he would really maintain control up until the 40s, if you will. He would assume control in around 1922. And as we said, he kind of transformed the New Orleans Mafia from kind of a black hand extortion group to a legitimate criminal family. And for Marcello, hanging out in Gretna was big for him because that's where he'd meet an individual called Peter Todaro. Peter Todaro was a capo regime that had business in Gretna. And he was a capo in the Matranga crime family. He was a big time member. He would kind of take Carlos under his wing and kind of offer a mentorship to him. And by the age of 25, he would promote Carlos to membership, and he'd become a made member of the New Orleans crime family. Now, for Carlos, things were good. He was 25. He was making money. He had a bar. He was making a little scratch on the sides in pool halls and gambling spots. He would also meet a woman around that time. He would come into contact with a beautiful woman called Jacqueline. Now, one thing about Jacqueline that we'd have to talk about is her last name was Todaro. She was actually the niece of his mentor, Frank Todaro. He would ask for her hand, and within 4 months, he fell in love with her. They would be married in September of 1936. Now, Carlos would live in a small apartment on Tetchy Street in Algiers. He had a liquor store below it, and his wife would actually run that business. So For Carlos Marcello, he quickly realized that, getting money, creating legitimate income with it would allow you to make more money than take that money and throw it back into, other businesses and things of that nature. He also would create a business that was distributing pinball and jukebox machines. Obviously, that was a huge thing in the 30s and into the 40s. And this would ultimately become where Carlos would become very rich very quickly and make very big time connections. He would create a company with his brother called the Jefferson Music Company, and he'd eventually corner the market. He basically would say, if you had a pinball machine or jukebox, we were going to be the ones that were giving it to you. Now, with the money he made, he realized that the drug trade was in a very effective way to make a lot of money. He saw big profits pushing marijuana in not only New Orleans, but in Gretna. By 1935, he and his partners were really, according to the Federal Narcotics Bureau, some of the biggest weed dealers in New Orleans. Weed was big business, and they were pushing a lot of it. I mean, Carlos Marcello was not pushing, dime bags or QPs. They were pushing pounds of marijuana. By 1938, an undercover drug agent would actually pinch Carlos Marcello. He would ask to buy 23 pounds of weed from Carlos. And again, he happened to be a federal agent, and Carlos was busted. For them, though, he again wouldn't really face much of a punishment. He would plead guilty in front of an individual, Judge Ruffs Foster, and was sentenced to a year in Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. He was fined about $77,000 as well. The problem for the government was Carlos Marcello never really had to pay for a crime. Strings were pulled, and as usual, a very lax government, he would be pardoned about 9 months in. So he only did about 9 months of his year sentence. He would head back down to New Orleans, get right back to work in his jukebox business. He continued to assist Mr. Tadaro and the men of his family. The goal now, though, was for Marcello, it was to get away from maybe the more nefarious things like marijuana selling and really become incredibly connected, making the right connections, becoming very rich, and having the lay of the land and having connections with it. Carlos was the point man. He was paying off police. He was becoming very powerful, but he wanted more. Now, there was a lot going on, and we talked about this during some of the episodes we did about Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello. One of the big problems that people like Frank Costello are running into, Costello was very connected in pinballs, poker machines, that sort of business, slot machines. And the issue that Mr. Costello would have is in the mid-30s, Mr. LaGuardia was elected mayor of New York, and he despised the mafia. He was Italian. He was a good Italian. He waged war on crime and the gamblers that were kind of trying to take over his city. At one point, LaGuardia had that famous radio broadcast where he said, "Let's drive the bums out of town." And he kind of said, if you're a gangster, get the hell out of here, basically. And what he did was he took an assault on illegal poker machines, gambling of any kind, and pretty much drove them out of New York. By 1935, the machines that Costello had were either confiscated or just destroyed. At one point, Mr. LaGuardia would actually throw the machines into I believe, East River at one point. It was a big issue. And for Frank Costello, it meant he would lose a lot of money. And I heard it compared one time to kind of being like Frank Costello would buy 10 racehorses and none of them would be allowed to race. He had all this equipment that was just sitting there and he wasn't able to use it. So he got the smart idea to connect with a person called Huey Long. Huey Long was the ex-governor of the state of Louisiana. He was very connected in the public political scene down in New Orleans. He connects with him. They make a deal. Costello has 1,000 machines or so, and he places them in New Orleans. Now, again, remember, it's not like he could just place these machines in New Orleans and that would be that. He would have to make this political connection through an individual called Philip Castell, Dandy Phil Castell. He was an aide to Frank Costello. He was a guy that had a lot of confidence, and he was kind of put in control of handling this. He would work closely with Huey Long and a guy, James Bricado. Now, Bricado and Huey Long were both very connected to the New Orleans Mafia, obviously being the governor and being corrupt. They all had a lot of connections in that area. Carlos was slotted in as the guy to handle all of the machines. And remember, he had the Jefferson Music Company, so he could install all these different machines and he could handle everything, but he was going to get a fee. He would also kind of be connected with Costello's newest operation, which was this company that, ran these machines. Now, for him, Carlos knew that he could handle the effort of operating on the machines. And these machines were pumping out a lot of money. People love to gamble. You think if you have, let's just say you have 1,000 machines and they're making $10 a day. I mean, that's a lot of money you can make. And remember, this is in the 30s and 40s. Now, what Marcello really knew right away was if you had political power, you could do what you wanted. Something like Al Capone realized. Carlos would become very close with the chief of police in Gretna, Beauregard Miller. And he knew that, yeah, you'd have to spend some money. But if you had the law on your side, you could literally do whatever you wanted. It was said at one point that Carlos Marcello had incredibly deep pockets on his pants. At one point, it was an old wives' tale that Carlos Marcello could store $30,000 to $40,000 in cash in his pocket. He would just walk around doling out payoffs to people, whether it was cops or representatives or whoever. He was incredibly good at realizing that. And that's why people like Marcello and Frank Costello and all these different people were so highly regarded. In fact, by 1944, Carlos was so connected with the mafia from a national perspective, he would have the share of a place called the Beverly Club. It was a legitimate gambling casino. It was one of the first nightclub gambling casinos in New Orleans. And alongside Frank Costello, Meyer Lansky, and a state legislator called Freddie Rickefer, all of these guys would have a stake in this place called the Beverly Club. Carlos was brought in as a shareholder, and a lot of historical accounts would say that at one point he had about 12.5% of the casino. There was also a rumbling that he purchased 20% for about $45K. But again, this was big money. He was now a very rich individual, and he was playing with the big boys. He was not, selling pounds of marijuana on the street or hanging out in a dingy bar in Gretna. He was making big money. Now, the Beverly Club ended up being a major windfall for these guys. It would open in December of 1945, and citizens and distinguished people alike would come in. They had beautiful bars and dining rooms and gaming areas. People like Jimmy Durante and boxers were there, and entertainers and athletes. Carlos was the manager, obviously, of the club, and some of his brothers would hang out as well, including his brother Anthony and Peter. They'd become very involved in actually the day-to-day operations. He'd even hired Jefferson Parish Police as doormen and bouncers. And again, it's the same song and dance. These guys were making money. They were getting the right people involved, and everyone was becoming a partner, if you will. At one point, the chief of detectives of New Orleans Police, John Grosh, was found to have a safe deposit box containing over $150,000 in cash. Now, remember, that's in 1940, okay? To put that into perspective, this individual had a box with about $3.1 million in it. This was a person in John Grosh that was making about $185 a month. That's the kind of money he was making of someone like Frank Costello for being involved with the casino. Carlos paid off everyone, and he got everyone involved in the Borgata. And he knew that happy people were making money, and making money, they were happy. It was pretty simple. Now, by the mid-40s as well, Carlos, as we didn't talk about didn't have to enter World War II because he wasn't a citizen. So he was able to sit back, relax, and not have to worry about war, and was making a lot of money. He would also get involved in other ventures as well. They would continue to build up the jukebox and pinball business, but he would also get involved with a wager service for racetrack gamblers. He would work with a member of the New Orleans Mafia called Joe Pareto, who would become one of his top lieutenants, and they would take over the largest racing wire service in Louisiana. So all the different tracks down there, whether it was Louisiana Downs or all these different places, they would report race results and things of that nature. And back in those days, it was different than today. Today, if you bet on a race at Louisiana Downs, you can go on TVG or Twin Spires and get the results within 5 minutes of the race. In those days, you'd have to kind of contact the service and they would be able to throw it out to you. So with all this stuff he was making money on, whether it was a casino or a race service or the jukebox business or the bar or the liquor store, he became a very rich man. By this point, he and his wife, Jacqueline, now had 4 children, and they needed to move to a bigger home. He would move to an area called Marrero, which was a very nice suburb about 10 miles away from New Orleans. He would buy a home for about $42,000. Now, remember, I mean, $42,000, think of this, this is in the mid 40s. So he bought a very beautiful home in those times. That would equate today to about $630K. So think of your, wherever you live. So if you live in, let's just say New Orleans, I mean, that's a very nice palatial area. It's a very nice spot. Now, this was also a major point in his career for Marcello because in 1947, the boss of New Orleans, Silver Dollar Sam Carolla, for about 10 years was facing deportation. He decides, you know what, I'm pretty old by this point. Keep in mind, I mean, Silver Dollar Sam was in his 50s. I mean, he was facing a lot from the government. He decides to head back to Italy. He was from Terracini, a spot in Italy and Sicily, and he decides, you know what, I'm going to just leave. I'm going to give up control. Now, he had a son, Anthony Carolla, who was, someone that was involved with the mafia. He assumed that he would take over control, and why not? He's the son of the mob boss, but not so fast. By this point, the man for the job was Carlos Marcello, and that's exactly what happened. He had immense power. He took it over everything. He had the casino. And in fact, by this point, he'd actually owned his own casino called the New Southport Club. On May 5th, 1947, a group of individuals that really had most of the control of the family would all go to a bar in the back room of a bar called the Black Diamond in New Orleans. Now, at the seat of the table that night were notable New Orleans mobsters, Tom Rizzuto, Frank Lombardino, Joe Capro, Anthony Carolla, Joe Pareto, Nofio Pecora, and Carlos's brothers, Vincent, Joseph, Peter, Anthony, Jake, and Nick. They were all involved, including his nephews as well. They were all involved with the mob. And pretty much everyone in the room appointed Carlos as the new boss of New Orleans. Now, Carolla was mad. He wanted to be the guy. But in the end, Marcello's panache spoke for itself. He was making a ton of money. He was very connected. He was very big nationally. And he was dialed in to the world of New Orleans politics. Now, I want to kind of sidetrack it for just 1 second. According to FBI reports, they would actually make claims that for a long time, really from the mid 40s until the early 60s, there was actually a shadowy figure that was running New Orleans, not called Carlos Marcello. Now, you'll hear some historians discuss this. It was said that a man called Leo Luca Trombadore was running New Orleans. He had actually been very close and a familial cousin to Giuseppe Morello. Morello kind of instructed him to go down to New Orleans and handle things, but there's very little evidence to back that up. I guess it is possible, but The man in New Orleans was Carlos Marcello. Now, his underboss would be his brother Joe. His brother Vincent was also made into the family. And other members of the family were also involved, including um, one of his brothers, Salvatore. He was a soldier in the family. So he pretty much kept everyone in control in his family in the world of the New Orleans Mafia. Now, Carlos, as the new boss, would hold court out of a bar called the Willswood Terrace. He would actually also be integral in opening a restaurant called Mosca's. Now, if you've ever been to New Orleans, Mosca's is actually still there today. You can go and get, in my estimation, from what I understand, one of the best Italian meals in New Orleans. It's actually in a little suburb called West Wego. It's a little spot. It's a little white building, right in that little town. And you can get a terrific meal. Funny enough, for Marcello, he would actually love to eat. And he would hire an individual called Provina Mosca to be the cook at this place called Mosca's. At one point, Provino Mosca was actually the personal chef of Al Capone. He was from Chicago. Carlos would buy the little house and tavern, and by 1951, he'd actually leave the tavern to Mosca to have. And to this day, it's still there. From what I understand, they have delicious food, as I kind of talked about earlier. I've actually talked to several people in New Orleans, and I'm sure we'll have a listener to tell me the same thing. Gave got great food. So if you're ever in the New Orleans area, I know if I ever get there, I'll make sure I get to Mosca's. Absolutely. By 1951, though, as we know, many mobsters were coming under the heat of the federal government. And during that time, the Tennessee Senator Estes Kefauver was summoning mobsters to explain themselves, right? You're going to go in front of our committee, and we're going to speak to witnesses, the hoodlums, the racketeers, and we're going to get the lay of the land. We want to hear about the mafia. The matter was, though, Kefauver wasn't going to get anyone to actually talk. No one actually talked during any of this. And Carlos was summoned alongside his brother Anthony. Also interviewed was James Bricado, Joe Pareto, Dandy Phil Castell, the old political fixer, and the mayor of New Orleans. So there were plenty of people that were having to speak about their involvement or their knowledge of the American mafia, particularly New Orleans. Now, Carlos would be grilled about all sorts of things, everything from his bars, his clubs, to the slot machine companies he ran, to the casino, to the racing wire service. And what it also allowed Kefauver to do was he'd also try to get some info out of Carlos about his relationships with different mobsters, including Santo Trafficante, the boss of Tampa, and Joe Cervello, who was very connected in Dallas. He ran organized crime in Dallas, Texas. Now, for anyone that's curious, Carlos's, territory was not just New Orleans. He was very much controlled Dallas, Arkansas, different areas of Mississippi, into Oklahoma. I mean, he controlled all sorts of territory and had all sorts of people kind of in his camp. It's funny because during the hearings, as we know, many mobsters didn't say anything. Carlos Marcello would take the fifth 152 times. The only question he'd actually answered was when he was asked by a committee member, "What laws have you violated?" Marcello would respond, quote, "Not being an attorney, I would not know." And I'm sure he would do it better. New Orleans accent's tough. The one thing we would find out about Marcello is we'd actually get to see him. And what we'd find out was he was a little fella. He's a stocky little guy, had a big, large head, a little squat body. It was estimated that Carlos Marcello was like 5'2", 5'3". Now, I'm sure people will make height jokes about myself and compare me to Carlos Marcello, but I'm actually significantly taller than Mr. Marcello. At one point, he'd become to be known as the midget of the mafia. He was also called on television the evil genius of crime and one of the principal criminals in the United States and #1 hoodlum. So, one thing it would do was it put a face to the name of Carlos Marcello. But for law enforcement, they just didn't get much out of the Kefauver hearings. It was a different time for the mafia. It just was. By 1953, Carlos continues to not only make a ton of money, but as every good entrepreneur does, he started buying up a bunch of real estate, including kind of a group of buildings just outside of Louisiana in an area called Rossier City. What he would buy is a bunch of office complexes and a motel block, a restaurant, a lounge, kind of an office complex, a strip mall, if you will. Included in that block of property was a place called the Town and Country Motel. Now, for the rest of his criminal career, this is where Carlos Marcello would run his operation. It was only about 5 minutes from a home he would buy, which we'll get into in just a second. And this is where his business would be run. He had a huge mahogany desk, and all the people in his inner circle hung out there. All his trusted lieutenants, Norfio Pecora, Joe Pareto, his brother Anthony, everyone kind of oversaw operations from that place right there. Even Pecora's wife, Frances, would actually act as Carlos Marcello's secretary. And this is where there was a great quote that came out of the office building. On a front door in the building, there was a message that read, 3 can keep a secret if 2 are dead. That's one of the great quotes from Carlos Marcello. He'd always said that 3 people can keep a secret as long as 2 people aren't around to talk about it. And this is where it was kind of realized by Marcello that he was the king of the volcano, if you will. He was a very rich man. He was a very powerful man. And he had realized by this point that not only he controlled Louisiana, but as I said, his criminal operations extended into Mississippi, Arkansas, Texas, Alabama, Nevada. I mean, he had interest in California, into Mexico, the Caribbean, Guatemala. He had income coming from gambling, casinos, narcotics, prostitution, slots, extortion. He was bribing public officials, judges, peace officers, prosecutors, mayors, councilmen, state legislators. He even had a member of Congress in his pocket. Now, with all this illegal money, he was able to go and buy all sorts of capital, whether it was real estate, motels, restaurants, banks, liquor stores, taxi companies, bus firms, shrimp boats, gas stations. He controlled so much. His fortune was vast. And as we said, by the 50s, early 60s, Carlos Marcello was making revenues in the billions with a B. That is a vast criminal enterprise. When it comes to mafia bosses, there is no person in the history of the mafia that controlled one man that controlled more territory than Marcello. There just isn't. Sorry. You have a lot of rich people in the mob history. You did. But they all were part of a family, and it was all a bunch of people in the family that controlled it. Marcello was the guy. It's that simple. Now, it's funny because he claimed a lot of his fortune came from land deals that he made. He also would claim that at one point that he was just a salesman. He worked for a company called Pelican Tomato Company in Metier, Louisiana, and earned about $1,500 a month. Now, on paper, he probably owned the company. But as I heard one author talk about, he must have been the greatest tomato salesman in the history of mankind to be that wealthy and rich. So we basically are looking at from 47 to 1960-ish. He would probably be the richest mobster in America. And I don't know if it's a question. He absolutely was one of the most powerful and influential. He had the commission. They didn't really bother him. He did what he wanted. It's not like they came down and told him what he was going to do. He opened his books when he wanted. He made men when he wanted. He didn't have to deal with the commission. In my opinion, if you asked me who the most powerful mobster in the history of American mob was, it's Marcello. Because unlike him, he had a unique ability to not really have to worry about the commission. And he controlled such a vast territory. Now, interestingly enough, a mobster out of New England would actually talk about Marcello at one point and say, quote, "It was very tight. They were all in deathly fear of Marcello because he's got the law, all the politicians in his state writing in his hip pocket. You just can't go against him." And that the control that he had was incontestable. There was nobody bigger. And what was so crazy about his mass success was he had no education. This is a guy that spoke in broken English. This is a guy that hadn't commanded the language. As you know, if you've ever been to New Orleans, they have a very interesting way of speaking. They have that Cajun kind of accent, right? A lot of nuttins and dats, right? He only went to school till 14. This is a guy that was a multi-hundred millionaire, likely. Immense success. Crazy. In 1961, there was an individual that used to be an FBI agent. He actually worked for the New Orleans Crime Commission. He actually was tasked by the federal government to report as a kind of historical authenticator and expert on Marcello. He would kind of talk about and lay out kind of how the family divvied things out. Now, Peter Marcello, his eldest brother, would actually manage strip clubs in the French Quarter. His brother Pascal would have a gambling house in Gretna. One of his younger brothers, Vincent, ran the Jefferson Music Company. They would handle pinball and jukebox machines. Joe Jr., his son, was his right-hand man. And not only did he work under his father, but he would run the wire service and booking network that Carlos had. Brother Tony would help run the Town and Country Motel that Carlos did business out of. And other brother Sammy, his youngest brother, would actually aid in the management of the Jefferson Music Company. So everyone kind of had a job. Carlos had very close family. Everybody was married. Everybody had, the willpower to on Sunday meet for a meal. It's pretty crazy how truly well done the family was as far as how everyone had a job. I just can't talk enough about Carlos Marcello and his success. By this point, he and his wife decided, you know what? We're even richer now. We've got these kids. Let's move to a big ass house. That's exactly what they did. Carlos Marcello would purchase an 8-bedroom home with tile roofs and Corinthian arches in the beautiful suburb of Metier. It's interesting because, I've actually seen his home. Carlos Marcello would actually die at this home, which we'll get to down the road. It is beautiful. It's right across the street from a country club. It's a beautiful part of Metier. One of his neighbors was actually head of a wealthy family that about 50 years before was the head of the mafia. He also would have a summer home across Lake Pontchartrain in Covington, Louisiana. It was good for Carlos Marcello. Things were great. He had no issues. Nothing was wrong. But as we know, this is where things start to get very hairy for Carlos Marcello, right around the late 50s, 1959 to be exact. As we know, the Kefauver hearings didn't garner much for Carlos Marcello or really for the government, but they would also, though, 6 years later, set up another committee under John McClellan of Arkansas to really investigate OC and labor racketeering. We started to find out that the mafia was a continued worry for the U.S. government, and they wanted to bring them down. Now, the chief counsel for the McClellan hearings not only were John Kennedy, Senator John Kennedy, but chief counsel was his brother, Robert F. Kennedy. And when I poll people about the mafia, and if I ever mentioned Carlos Marcello, the first name they bring up was RFK. And this is where the hate for RFK starts, for Carlos Marcello. And this is where things start to get very interesting. Carlos will be called to the meeting on March 24th, 1959, after he was given a subpoena and served that he would have to go and speak. Now, he had tried to get out of it, but he had to end up going. And on that day, as we know, whether it was in 1928 or 1929 or 1946 or 1957, all these different meetings would happen, these national summits, if you will. In 1957, as we know, the Appalachian meeting happened. Now, Joe Marcello, Carlos's brother, and Joe Cervello, who was running Dallas, who was kind of a satellite of the Marcello family, they actually went to Appalachian. This is where and why the McClellan hearings happened, because Appalachian really put, as we know, the mob on the government purview. And now people like Marcello having to explain themselves. And Carlos would kind of just think to himself, basically, there's really no evidence that I'm associated with organized crime. Why am I here? Now, as we know, though, and what I'll talk about, before we actually would hear from Carlos Marcello, we would hear from Aaron Cohn, who, as I said, was a former FBI agent. He was the head of the New Orleans Crime Commission. He was an expert on Louisiana criminal elements, basically. He had been involved with the arrests of John Dillinger and Ma Barker gangs and Babyface Nelson and all these different people. And he would spend the next 20 or so years investigating crime in Louisiana. And at this point, his man in control that he was dealing with was Carlos Marcello. And what he really did was he did exactly what I'm doing right now. He laid out the structure of the Louisiana Mafia. He told the committee everything that Carlos is involved in and everything that his family was in control in, how they basically dominated the underworld of New Orleans, and that how the mafia in New Orleans had dominated the criminal underworld for the last 70 years. He talked about the fact that Carlos Marcello's slot operation had 5,000 machines in place. He would talk about that the company would earn $500 million annually from illegal gambling, $100 million from legitimate interest in transportation, financing, housing, and service industries, $100 million from illegal activities in bars, taverns, whorehouses, prostitution. He had a crew that would handle professional burglaries and holdups. That made him about $10 million a year. Prostitution brought in about $10 million a year. And he also earned about $100 million in the form of not paying his taxes correctly. As I said, in a Post article, a Saturday Evening Post article in 1964, it would claim that the enterprise in that year earned $2 billion in revenue from the 50s into the 60s. That's crazy, each year. And this was a big problem for Marcello, because this was the first person to really put his issues and the things that he was doing on Front Street. Now, as usual for Carlos Marcello, he didn't answer any questions. He'd cite the Fifth Amendment many times. Now, the young Kennedy was starting to get pissed off. Robert Kennedy believed that you're not going to show him disrespect. And both these guys had stubborn personalities, whether it was the young Kennedy or the old guy Marcello. No one wanted to say anything. No one wanted to show their hand. Now, Kennedy was infuriated, but Marcello was more infuriated. And this would set up several years in a row of just people going at each other, retaliation. And the first to hit was Robert Kennedy, which we'll talk about here in just a second. The one issue that Marcello always had, while he was rich, while he was powerful, while he was politically connected, while he pretty much owned New Orleans and the state of Louisiana, the one thing that he could not get past was the fact that he was not a citizen. In fact, no one really knew where he was from. Was he from Sicily? Was he from Tunisia? No one really knew. Now, one of the countries that Carlos was doing a lot of business in was Guatemala. A lot of the fruit that his companies used were from that country. He had a lot of trade connections there. He smuggled weapons. I mean, he was very connected in Guatemala. That's where he got his marijuana. And it wasn't very far. I mean, think about the geographical locale of Guatemala. I mean, it's not far from New Orleans. He could be there in a couple hours. He would hire a criminal friend of his called Carl Knoll to basically create a fictitious Guatemalan birth certificate. And that would kind of be his ace in the hole. If he were ever called into question, he would use this, and that would be that. He would bribe a lawyer called Antonio Villadores and Associates to kind of create the gap in the entries of the birth registry. And they would say that he was from a village called San Jose Panula. They gave him his birth name, Colodro Minocore. They'd even use specially antiquated ink to get past and to make it look legitimate. So Carlos believed that he had the ace in the hole. Now, as we know, in 1961, John Kennedy would become president. And John Kennedy did something really bad for Carlos Marcello and for the mafia. He put his brother, Robert Kennedy, in control of the Justice Department. And guess what Mr. Justice Department does? He has it out for Marcello. And this is where the first list agenda was get Marcello, get him out of here. And he knew he could get him out. He knew that the one weakness that Marcello had was he was not a citizen. Now, Robert Kennedy would write a book called The Enemy Within. And he would say, quote, in the book, if we do not attack organized criminals with weapons and techniques as effective as their own, they will destroy us. And then he had, quote, never forgotten the way Marcello had treated him in the McClellan hearings. He decided to use unorthodox methods to strike back at Carlos Marcello. Now, he was aware, according to him, of the forged birth certificate that Carlos Marcello likely had, and he would use this as a way to deport Carlos forever. In 1961, Carlos tried to get out in front of it by, paying a visit to the immigration office, which he was required to do so. He would ultimately, though, be led away in handcuffs and be sent to a motorcade at the international airport. He'd be bundled into an aircraft and flown to Guatemala City, 1,200 miles away. About a month later, he would have his lawyer follow for an immediate return. Now, this is where Marcello gets dealt with, and Kennedy thinks that he has it figured out. The next 8 weeks would be a real problem for Marcello. After he's arrived in Guatemala, he was able to call his wife. They would actually come and join Carlos in Guatemala. They'd be moved to the Biltmore Hotel along with his lawyer and two of his brothers, Sammy and Vincent. About a month after the arrival, the government would inform Carlos that it had arranged for them to be returned to America. When the party arrived to the airport to embark on their trip back, Carlos was suddenly told that his visa had been denied. Instead, he and his lawyer were taken by Secret Service agents into El Salvador and left at an army camp. Eventually, they were taken to the capital of El Salvador, San Salvador, and handed over to a commander of a large military barracks. The commander would inform the two men that they'd be taken to Honduras, to a small provincial airport where they would fly to the country and go back. Now, that's not exactly truthful, because about 6 hours into travel on this bus they were on, they were simply just dropped off in the middle of the jungle and left. And think about it like this. Marcello is in his 40s. He's got a suit with alligator shoes on, and he's dropped off pretty much in the middle of the jungle. He would ultimately stagger into an airport and hire an aircraft that would fly him from the Honduras capital home. Now, according to many onlookers, Carlos was, quote, battered, bruised, and utterly exhausted, and they would check into a hotel and sleep for about 2 days. They would then fly back to New Orleans and reassure Marcello's family that Carlos was okay and that he'd arrive back to America several weeks later. Weirdly enough, Marcello claimed that he obtained a visa and bought a ticket to a commercial flight to Miami where he had no trouble passing through customs. But the government would contend that he had in fact been flown into the country aboard an aircraft from the Dominican Republic, and that he likely had longtime connections with the General Rafael Trujillo, who many people in America had connections to, including his old friend Santo Traficante, who obviously pulled some strings to get him back in the country. So by that year, he's back in America, and he goes right back to business as usual. But as we know, Robert Kennedy continues to aggravate Marcello. On October 30th of that year, he would announce an indictment on Marcello on falsifying his Guatemalan birth certificate and perjury. And on December 30th, the Board of Immigration Appeals would uphold his deportation order. But by this point, Marcello was done with Kennedy. He was absolutely furious about that month to 6-8 weeks that he had to have in Central America. And he felt it was a complete slap in the face to him as a man. And this is where there starts to become a lot of talk from Carlos Marcello that I think a lot of people didn't necessarily want to believe, but it was a writing on the wall. Throughout summer and fall of 1962, Carlos would continue to be pressured by the feds. He had indictments looming. There were tax liens against him, very heavy tax liens. Obviously, the government knew he had forged his birth certificate. And he knew that once and for all, over the last 10 to 15 years, he may actually get deported. And this is where things get interesting. In September of 1963, the author Ed Reed would visit a property that Marcello owned called Churchill Farms on the west bank of the Mississippi River. It was about a 6,500 acre property. Now, Marcello had purchased this property in 1959 for about $1 million. He was making a lot of money. Why not? He went there and hunted. He would hang out and bust balls. He had a conference room where he'd invite different people and, hang there and drank and talk business. It was just a kind of a camp, if you will. Think of it like Camp David for any political people out there. And what would happen is people that were close to Marcello would turn up there and they would talk and bullshit, including a guy called Jack Liberto. Now, Liberto was very involved in the mafia. He was a soldier in the New Orleans crime family. He was very close to Marcello. He worked in the produce business. He actually at one point drove for Marcello. Also, there was a person called Carlos Rupolo. He was another one of Carlos's main men. Longtime friend. He'd actually knew him back when they were kids in Algiers in New Orleans. Now, Ed Reed would say that he would go at one point to this place and he was invited in to talk. Now, another man there at the time was a guy called Edward Becker. It was a friend of Rupolo. He was a friend of Marcello. He was actually a private investigator at one point. And they were discussing different things between at the hunting camp and at Town and Country, Carlos's headquarters. They would spend the day drinking and talking shop. And this is where Becker and Reed start hearing comments from Marcello that started to be pretty interesting. At one point, Carlos started stomping around the room, ranting and screaming about what he was going to do to Robert Kennedy. In Sicilian, he would say, quote, "Take the stone out of my shoe." He looked at Becker and said, "Don't worry about that son of a bitch, Bobby. He's going to be taken care of." Now, in the book, The Grim Reaper by Ed Reed, he would talk about the fact that it was interesting because apparently Carlos Marcello didn't speak Sicilian. He spoke Italian, which was kind of interesting. He also would say to Becker would say to Marcello, quote, "You can't go after Bobby. Look at the trouble that will bring you." Carlos said, "No, not that." He'd also say in Sicily, they say if you want to kill a dog, you don't cut off the tail, you cut off the head. which Becker would say that to him, it was very clear that he would state that he had planned to have President Kennedy murdered, not Robert Kennedy. He believed that if he killed Robert Kennedy would go away. Now, Becker would meet Marcello again on different occasions. They would meet at multiple places, including a couple weeks later, they would meet in Miami Beach with Santo Trafficante, the mob boss from Tampa, at the Scott Byron Hotel. They would discuss business in Cuba with a businessman called Jose Allman Jr. Now, he was there trying to raise some money to build some condos and apartments in Cuba. And this would come from the Teamsters, as we know. Now, during the conversation, Trafficante would also get on the act as well. He hated Kennedy also. He would belittle Robert Kennedy for his war against Hoffa and made mention to the fact that he and his brother, the president, were serious trouble. Now, Mr. Aylman, the Cuban, would support President Kennedy, though, and he thought he would probably be reelected. Trafficante seriously looked him in the face and said, quote, "You don't understand me, Jose. Kennedy's not going to make it to the election. Someone's going to hit him." Now, the problem that Trafficante has was Aylman was a rat. And he would say under oath that this conversation he reported to FBI agents Paul Scranton and George Davis, but no one in the agency took any action. They believed that it was just Trafficante and Marcello talking a bunch of shit. And this is where it starts to kind of make sense, because it was clear Marcello hated Kennedy. He had threatened that he was going to kill him. Trafficante was obviously very involved. Now, there would be people that would go against this story. A high-end police intelligence chief called Hubie Badu would say many years later that Marcello never talked like that. He's not even Sicilian. He was born in North Africa, which is not really true. I mean, he is Sicilian, but he didn't know Sicilian because he never lived in Sicily. He lived in Tunisia. He would say, quote, "You have to know Marcello in the way that he talked, how stupid that story is." A lawyer for Marcello and Trafficante, Frag Regano, would also say he doesn't speak that shit when talking Sicilian, only English. So whether we agree with this story or not, it is interesting. And that came from, people that were directly involved with Marcello. It really depends who you believe. Regano, though, would also say that in 1987, when he visited Trafficante and they were on a drive on Bayshore Boulevard in Tampa, in Sicilian, Regano was told by Trafficante, quote, "We shouldn't have killed John. We should have killed Bobby." So there's a lot of back and forth. The people that matter here, Trafficante and Marcello, both had very similar points that they made about the Kennedys. The truth was both hated them. As we know, the FBI would continue to investigate this in the Warren Commission because, look, the truth is, in 1963, we all know what happened on Friday, November 22nd, 1963, John Kennedy would be killed. We don't need to go through that. We all know that. The FBI and the government would present that there was one solitary shooter, a lone gunman called Lee Harvey Oswald. They would claim that he would use a rifle and that he was a terrific shot, and he was this incredible marksman. Now, many people that knew Lee Harvey Oswald would say that they couldn't believe it because they had known him, the former Marine, as a mediocre marksman. I mean, if he was that good of a marksman, wouldn't the American military have given him sniper duties? I feel like they would. Now, look, I'm not going to rehash the actual assassination. I mean, you can do that for yourself. There are thousands of books about it. We've seen documents and reports and articles, and the Warren Commission would actually be created. Now, the Warren Commission ended up just not really looking into a conspiracy. They really just looked into the actual murder. And I urge you, if you are very interested in this, you should definitely read into people like Robert Blakely, who are involved with the Warren Commission. But I kind of want to talk about the connections that the people involved in this assassination had to Mr. Marcello. Now, Lee Harvey Oswald was very connected to New Orleans. His uncle, a man called Charles Marcello, was actually a bookie for Carlos Marcello. He would actually act as his father. It was very much found out that Lee Harvey Oswald, his only surrogate father was Charles Marcello. And he actually worked Marcello under Sam Saya, who was very high up in the Marcello organization. So there very much was a close connection between Marcello and Marcello and Saya, who were all connected to Lee Harvey Oswald. It's also very widely well known that Lee Harvey Oswald's mother, Margaret, dated many members of the Carlos Marcello organization. So it's not like, Lee Harvey Oswald was just some recluse lunatic that just happened to do this, which is what the government wanted you to believe. Now, as we know, days later, Lee Harvey Oswald would be killed. He'd be shot in the abdomen by an individual called Jack Ruby. Now, Jack Ruby, according to the Warren Commission, had no definite mob connections, which we would find out is completely false. He was a strip club owner who had a very close relationship with members of the Dallas organized crime family, as well as Carlos Marcello and Santa Trafficante Jr. Now, if you know anything about Jack Ruby, he was actually born Jacob Rubenstein in 1911 in Chicago. And he would have ties from 1947 on in the Dallas mob. And weirdly enough, on November 24th, he was just miraculously escorted through the basement of the Dallas police headquarters. And he miraculously died, about 2 years later from cancer. So the connection to the assassination, both were now dead. Now, interestingly enough, the night before the Kennedy assassination, Jack Ruby would have dinner with a man called Joseph Campisi. Now, Campisi is the number 2 man under Jack Savello in Dallas. And as we know, Dallas was a faction of New Orleans. It was pretty much run by Marcello. Now, Jack Ruby was the missing link between everybody involved here. Now, why don't we know about that? Why doesn't the federal government tell America about that? Because outside of mob buffs like us, no one really knows that. Now, Peter Noyes and Ed Reed, the author I talked about, would be the first to connect Marcello to JFK's assassination. In his book, The Grim Reaper, in 1969, Peter Noyes would actually write a book called Legacy of Doubt, published in 1973. And just as the president was shot, guess who had their deportation hearing that day? Carlos Marcello. And guess what happened? He beat the rap. Carlos Marcello continued to live with a 4-leaf clover up his ass. Dreaded Kennedy was dead. He was happy. Why wouldn't he be? At 1:30 that day, everybody was notified that Kennedy was killed. The only person that was actually happy was Carlos Marcello. He walked out of the courtroom slowly with a very big smile on his face. A couple hours later, a verdict of not guilty had come in, and he had beat the rap on both charges in the deportation case. A few minutes later, Air Force One would leave Dallas Airport and carry the badly mutilated body of President Kennedy back to D.C. Now, for Marcello, though, in 1964, he would actually be indicted again on jury tampering after it was found out that he had paid off a jury in that case. But he would continue to beat the rap in those cases. The truth was, he just couldn't be dealt with. They had no way to bring Carlos Marcello in. He had friends everywhere. He had friends in high places, state friends, federal friends, governors, senators, labor leaders, everybody. At one point, 98% of the Louisiana state legislature would accept bribes, according to Peter Hand, a close friend of the governor. Think about that. 98%. Virtually every legislator accepted bribes. How do you ever bring this guy to justice? Now, Carlos also controlled the head of Louisiana State Police, Roland Coppola. And he also had a lock on the Department of Revenue, which would collect all state taxes. They would actually once assess his home, which was worth about $160,000, for about $8,000. When you wanted something done, you were Carlos Marcello, you got it done. As would happen as well, not only was Carlos a very rich man, he continued to maintain connections with everyone in America from a criminal standpoint. He was very close with Trafficante. He was really close with Chicago and Joey Dove Zayupa. He was connected with Joe and Nick Savella in Kansas City. He also was very connected with Angelo Bruno in Philadelphia, Dominic Brooklier in Los Angeles. And he also continued to be friends with people in the Genovese crime family like Frank Costello. Excuse me, guys. Now, I did want to talk about one group. A lot of people ask me about the Dixie Mafia. The Dixie Mafia were a band of guys that pretty much ran around the Dixie area, Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, committing crimes. Guess who was someone that was close to them? Who do we know? Carlos Marcello. And I don't mean to continue to say this, but I'm going to keep saying it. I'm going to keep saying it. I'm going to keep saying this. By the mid-60s, Carlos had done everything he needed to do. He was running a dynasty, and this had been going on for 20 years. Through corruption of pretty much every person in the state, he was the governor. It's that simple. And he was the preeminent leader of the mafia in America. No one was more influential. No one was more wealthy. The commission wasn't in his pocket bothering him. He did everything he wanted on his own. He manipulated politics, business, crime. It's that simple. I want to talk about a funny story. At one point in the 60s, 1966 actually, Carlos Marcello would give a check of $10,000 to a society of women who was raising money for the Girl Scouts of America. Marcello would tell the woman, quote, "Don't mention my name that I gave this donation. I don't want any publicity about this." The gift would be news all over New Orleans in 2 days. Everybody knew him, but he was even being good to the Girl Scouts. Now, in 1966, it wouldn't be meant that Carlos didn't have any connections with the commission. He would be involved with commission activities. And if you know anything about Appalachian, there's one thing you won't hear much about. It was a meeting at La Stella restaurant in Forest Hills, Queens. A large group of mobsters, high-end mobsters, would gather at a table in a private dining area in the basement, and they would talk turkey. Now, the police would raid that building and arrest everyone, all 13 of them. They were all members of the mafia. Now, at that meeting, it was a who's who of gangsters. Obviously, you know, Carlos Marcello was there. His son was there. Even Anthony Carollo was there. There were all sorts of people there, all sorts of major people in the office that day. Now, other men in the lunch were Mike Miranda and Tommy Aboli, Jerry Katina, the Genovese family, newly appointed Colombo boss Joe Colombo, Neil Della Croce, underboss of the Gambino family. Also included there was Joe Gallo, who was the Gambino consigliere, Dominic Alonghi, who was Tommy Aboli's driver, and a soldier from the Genovese family, Anthony Cirillo. Also from Florida, Santo Trafficante was there. Carlos, alongside his brother, Joe Jr., were there. Anthony Carollo, Frank Gagliano. It was a good group of guys. Now, the feds would burst, or not the feds, the NYPD would burst in and arrest everybody. Now, the funny thing is, all the people involved, fixed the dispute, resolved their matters, and went right back to La Stella for the rest of lunch. It's funny because it would actually be dubbed Little Appalachian. And for years, it would be insisted to law enforcement that he was never associated with the mafia. Now, the problem for Marcello was this was the first time that he could say, well, I guess maybe I am involved. Or people could say he was involved. Why would he be at lunch with all these mobsters if he wasn't involved with the mafia? And guess who were the first people to take note? The FBI office in New Orleans. Upon his return back to New Orleans, Carlos would say, quote, "What's the matter with some old friends getting together for lunch?" This was strictly a social gathering. That's all it was. Now, this meeting would make headlines everywhere, and news services would start picking it up everywhere. September 30th of that year, Carlos and his brother Joe would fly from New York to New Orleans. At the airport was a bunch of onlookers, spectators, reporters, photographers. A fracas would happen. And at one point, an FBI agent was there. He kept tabs on Carlos. According to this agent, Patrick Collins, he would approach Marcello. The little Marcello would shout at him, "I'm the boss around here," and then punched him in the face randomly. Carlos would ultimately be arrested for assaulting an FBI agent, but it was thought of years later that the reason Marcello socked Collins was he was having a relationship, Collins, with the wife of his brother Joe, a woman called Bootsy. So that was maybe why he socked Mr. Collins, who deserved it, quite honestly. Now, the good news, as usual, continues to hit Carlos Marcello. As we know, on June 15th, 1968, after Carlos was in court to hear the indictment was thrown out because of a hung jury that he was involved in, he got more good news. Robert Kennedy was gunned down in Los Angeles. And within 5 years, both John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy was dead. Is there a luckier person in the history of the mob than Carlos Marcello? I don't think there was. Now, interestingly, I want to just bring up the fact that the man that allegedly killed Robert Kennedy alone was Sirhan Sirhan. He was a Palestinian person. I do want to talk about the connections that, weirdly enough, Sirhan Sirhan may have just randomly had coincidentally to Marcello. Marcello was very good friends with Mickey Cohen, who was a mobster in LA. At one point, Sirhan Sirhan actually worked at Santa Anita Racetrack, which Mickey Cohen owned. Cohen was also very close with Jack Ruby, who killed Lee Harvey Oswald. Now, look, I'm not going to say that Robert Kennedy was hired by Mickey Cohen and or Marcello to kill Robert Kennedy, but it is interesting. Now, I am not really going to get into the MLK assassination. I did want to discuss that there is a lot of connection between the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. and Marcello. It's important to realize one of the very negative things about Marcello, for as rich and powerful as he was a very serious racist. It was alleged that Marcello hated Blacks. He vehemently opposed the civil rights movement. At one point during the 60s, he openly expressed his hatred of not only Martin Luther King, but Robert Kennedy, who he called MLK's White Knight. It was also very well known that Marcello was a known supporter of the Ku Klux Klan, that he generously was a supporter of anti-civil rights movements. Interestingly enough, FBI director at one point, J. Edgar Hoover, would share his views in that he nominated Martin Luther King as the Man of the Year. At one point, Marcello would say that, kind of vehemently going against everything. And there was a lot of things that Martin Luther King did that were amazing. He was a hero in American history, but Marcello hated him. It was just that simple. Now, 4 days after Martin Luther King was killed, a black man called John McFerrin would tell the FBI in Memphis that he had overheard a telephone conversation prior to the day of the murder in which a speaker would say, quote, "Kill that son of a bitch on the balcony, you will get $5,000. Don't come here, go to New Orleans and get the money." Now, the man on the telephone was identified as a man called Frank Liberto. He was the brother of Salvatore Liberto, who was very close with Carlos Marcello. Also, according to a journalist called William Sartor, the alleged killer of Martin Luther King, James Earl Ray, attended a meeting at either the Town and Country Motel, the hangout of Carlos Marcello, on December 17th, 1967. At this meeting was a guy called Charlie Stein, Salvatore Sam Di Piazza, Lucas DeLeo, and Salvatore Lacerda. All these men were involved with the New Orleans Mafia and were very connected with Carlos Marcello. Later, James Earl Ray would claim he left New Orleans on December 19 with $2,500 in cash and the promise of $12K to, quote, "do a big job early in the next year." So think about what I've just said over the last half an hour. We can make the case that Carlos Marcello was very involved with the planning and the masterminding of the assassination of John Kennedy. He may have been involved, coincidentally or truthfully, with the assassination of Robert Kennedy. There's a lot of evidence that he may have also been involved with killing Martin Luther King or having someone kill Martin Luther King. Now, in 1979, the House Select Committee on Assassinations would confirm the mob ties of the men and their links to Marcello. Now, in 1961, an intelligence report from the FBI disclosed that a prominent Ku Klux Klan member called William Mavis, who was the Imperial Wizard, had told a Klan gathering in October that racial problems in the South would only be eliminated by the murder of Dr. King, and that he had, quote, "underworld associates who would kill anyone for a price." So more on this. Salvatore Liberto, who was very connected to the Mafia and Marcello, and Sam Di Piazza were both king hitters in the gambling outfits of Marcello's empire. And it was not beyond the realm of possibility that Marcello would fund Ray as he stalked Dr. King through the South leading up to April of that year where he was killed. Now, the House Select Committee on Assassinations also concluded that there was a 95% probability that Martin Luther King was killed by a conspiracy. Now, many years later, in 1993, a man called Lloyd Jowers went on primetime television and stated that he hired the killer of Dr. King as a favor to New Orleans mob boss Carlos Marcello, who in turn was doing it as a favor to J. Edgar Hoover, who deep down hated Martin Luther King. He was also adamant, Jowers, that he was not James, or that the killer was not James Earl Ray. So there's a lot of interesting connections here. And the FBI file on Dr. King would consist of like 6,000 articles. In 1999, a lawyer called William Pepper would win a civil court verdict for the King family, which found a conspiracy, including Carlos Marcello, lay behind the murder of Dr. King. Plus, throw in the fact that it was very well known that Carlos Marcello was a known racist. For Carlos Marcello, offing people was not a problem, and it was also not hard to do. He could not only kill regular people, but he could kill anybody. He killed the president, for Christ's sakes. Listen, I'll always say, if you actually believe that Marcello was not involved with the murder of John Kennedy, I think you're nuts. I don't think you know much about anything, and I don't think you really read much. The Warren Commission is not something that I would ultimately very much believe in. And in fact, it really wasn't a look into the conspiracy in any way. But at the end of the day, Obviously, things were getting crazy for Marcello, but he continued to make a lot of money. By 1972, Carlos was 62 years old, the more powerful and probably the most powerful criminal in America. Carlos was probably bigger at that point than Carlo Gambino, who was particularly gigantic. The House Select Committee on Crime would declare in 1972 that Carlos Marcello was, quote, a formidable menace to the institution of government and the people of the United States. No government spokesperson would ever say that about Gambino. I think he was, as I said, the king of the volcano, and he had been the king of the volcano really for the last 20 years or so. Now, Carlos Marcello would again be called in front of the committee, and as usual, he didn't say anything. He would say, though, at one point, quote, "I'm not in no mafia, not in no racket, and not in organized crime." Now, the FBI would reopen and reorganize its New Orleans office and appoint a young, tenacious agent called Howard Hughes to head a strike force to target Marcello. And by 1972, J. Edgar Hoover was dead. So the carrying the water for the mob was over, and the government was starting to close in on Marcello. Now, as I said, there was a book released about the assassination of Kennedy, which would point a finger at Marcello. Although Ed Reed, the author of that book, had already given out connections that he was involved. By 1976, the 94th Congress established the House Select Committee on Assassinations to do and establish investigations on all these murders. And as I said, Robert Blakely, who would ultimately create the RICO statute down the road, was very connected and involved in all this stuff. One of the lead objectives in this case was for Robert Tannenbaum, the staff counsel, was to investigate the connection between Marcello and the assassination of Kennedy, and his name would quickly be raised as the chief suspect. In 1978, Carlos would appear as a witness before the House committee, and he had not been called as a suspect, and his sworn testimony was given under grant of immunity. He, however, though, would not say anything. In fact, not only he, but Santo Trafficante, in being interrogated, would take the fifth on every question. Carlos would say, quote, if he had any involvement in organized crime, speaking in his typical drawl, again, he would say, no, I don't know nothing about that. He denied the existence of Churchill Farms and lied and bluffed his way through the session, which, remember what we talked about before, where he went on that diatribe about how he was going to kill Kennedy. He would also at one point lose his cool when he was questioned about his illegal deportation, saying, quote, everybody in the United States knowing I was kidnapped. I told the whole world it was unfair, and he grew red with rage. So he continued to be hassled by the government. He would be very much involved with Jimmy Hoffa. There was all sorts of people that were, kind of connected to him. He knew everybody. But in the end, the government could never properly bring Carlos Marcello to any sort of justice. That would be until the late 70s, early 80s. Carlos Marcello would be introduced to a man called Joseph Hauser. Now, Hauser was a Los Angeles-based insurance operator. He was also, though, a convicted swindler. And he was anxious to kind of expand his business interests as far as insurance into Louisiana. And Carlos was paid for a fee. He would make a few calls, which would result in pretty much getting Hauser access into different insurance businesses, from the building trade union to the Teamsters to the longshoremen. And Hauser would leverage his business through an insurance company he purchased in New Orleans, using Carlos Marcello as the go-between. So there's the conspiracy right there. By the end of 78, Mr. Hauser was in trouble. The Security and Exchange Commission would place his company under receivership because of the irregularities that he had discovered in the way his business was set up. He would be hit with a hefty fine and be indicted on racketeering charges. He would plead guilty and set up prison time. And basically at that point, he was approached by the FBI, and they said to him, look, We can get out of this, but we want you to include Marcello in all this. So they set up this sting operation, and it would be known as Operation Brelab, which would be involved with bribery and labor. And that little stunt dethroned Marcello on April 2nd, 1979. Now, there was a lot going on for Marcello, and it was starting to become bad. Things had caught up to him. His longtime lawyer actually would die. And that over the years, Marcello had paid him a lot of money, not only in his different legal fights, especially his deportation case. They had originally entered a deportation case against Marcello way back in 1956, and he had been in the United States for a long time. It was the longest and costliest in United States history as far as deportation. In 1979, Carlos would admit for the first time ever that he belonged to the mafia. The FBI launched 2 operations against him, which would ultimately result in lengthy prison sentences and destroying him and his criminal enterprise. Remember, by this point, he was pretty old. Now, Hauser, the man who was aided by the FBI, set themselves up as representatives for this insurance company, and Marcello fed right into it, pretty much. Now, they used kind of different mobsters to kind of make all this happen, and they wanted Marcello bad. They set him up. They convinced him that he could be set up the judge and everything could be dealt with in time because, again, he was Marcello and that he could do what he had to do. Now, Hauser would also say he could guarantee Marcello that if he were to get arrested, that $125,000 would have to be paid and he could bribe the district court judge. Now, on June 17, 1980, Marcello, along with 3 other men, were indicted also on multiple counts of racketeering in a federal grand jury in this bribery case. The trial would be set for summer 1981, and in August of 1981, Carlos would again be indicted by a Los Angeles federal judge for conspiring to bribe a district judge. He was set up on that as well. Now, Carlos would maintain that he was not worried about anything. He would tell a reporter, quote, "They're not going to get me, man. No way, man. These are my people here." But remember, he was in Los Angeles. It was a different area. He wasn't in New Orleans. He wasn't in, any New Orleans suburb. It was a different place. The problem was he really had nothing to stand on here. They had him dead to rights. The FBI had amassed 1,400 reels of recorded tape that had Marcello and his co-conspirators. There was racketeering, there was conspiracy, there was mail and wire fraud. There was racketeering issues. Everything was on tape here. The FBI agents, Larry Montag and Michael Wax, had turned a witness against them. This was it for Marcello. It was that simple. There was no other ways to go. He couldn't bribe anybody else, and his luck had run out. On August 4th, 1981, a jury would return its verdict. Carlos Marcello would be found guilty on the charge of violating the RICO statute, which would carry ultimately a penalty of 12 years imprisonment. He would also be indicted and found guilty on bribing a federal judge as well. Now, the American Mafia was kind of shocked in a way. I think everyone felt Marcello was untouchable. Now, keep in mind, mentioned in those tapes, Joe Iuppa of Chicago, Santa Trafficante, Joe Savello, they were involved as presented evidence. Now, no way would Carlos take a deal or anything, but I'm sure they were worried for a little bit. On November 30th, 1981, Carlos Marcello would go on trial, and they'd find him guilty on all counts. Judge Maurice Seekin would hand down a sentence of 7 years in prison and a fine. Now, Carlos would wait until 82 to find out what his fate would be in Los Angeles. At that point, at 72, 7 years could be a life sentence for Marcello. He was in pretty poor health. Now, in Los Angeles, he would get an additional 10 years. The judge in that case would say to Marcello, quote, "You've led a life of crime. By any evaluation, it's fair to say You're a very bad man. On April 15th, 1983, all of his appeals would fail. Carlos would be remanded to federal prison. He'd report to the U.S. Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri, to begin his sentence. Now, 2 months later, he would learn his appeal against the conviction of bribing a judge would also be denied. He would now face the prospect that he would have to go to prison for the next 17 years. Now, remember, he is 72 years old. So if we did the math, let's say he did 15 years, he would get out at 87 if he lived that long. He would be incarcerated at Springfield for about a year. In 1984, he would be transferred to a federal prison in Texarkana, Texas, near the Texas-Arkansas state line. Now, he would stay there for the next 2 years. In 1986, he would be transferred to a minimum security prison in Seagoville in Texas. Now, this would be a prison that was very low end. It was for kind of fed summer camp people, white-collar criminals, doctors, accountants, embezzlement, that kind of stuff. Now, Carlos would be there for a short time, and he would be moved again in June of 1986 to a federal prison in Fort Worth, Texas. The Justice Department would never disclose why Carlos was moved so much in 3 years. Now, it would be possible that they just wanted to move him and kind of uproot him a little bit. Now, the federal prison in Fort Worth was, according to many people that know federal prisons, more like a rest home than a federal prison facility. Carlos could meet visitors at a picnic table, away from prying eyes and microphones. Now, two of the people that would allegedly come to see him regularly were his brothers, Joe and Sammy, and they would continue to carry on his business interests, both legitimate and illegal. Now, interestingly enough, one thing that Marcello did that was of note that I want to talk about is in 1979, even though he was worth hundreds of millions of dollars, likely, Carlos Marcello would actually apply for Social Security benefits. Now, for the last 11 years, he had fought that for him, it was his constitutional right to do so. And they had argued that his deportation to Guatemala was an illegal act. Now, although Social Security had received notification of his deportation, they claimed that he had never filed with them a lawful reentry after his deportation. A hearing in 1984 would determine that he was not entitled to benefits. And in 1986, the District Court of Louisiana agreed. So you got to admit, Carlos Marcello was an absolute treasure, wasn't he? The government had granted Carlos retirement benefits and that it would be tantamount to recognizing him as an American citizen. Still, though, as an illegal citizen, he would always be under the threat of deportation. And that the government could kick him out of the country once again. Now, he would ultimately live in Fort Worth till about 1987, and he would then be moved back to Texarkana prison. He'd be there till 1989, and for the final time, he'd be transferred to a prison hospital at FMC Rochester in Minnesota. By this point, Carlos Marcello was pretty sick. He was pretty disabled. He had Alzheimer's, and he had been diagnosed with several different health problems. All his appeals were exhausted. And in October of 1989, after serving 6 years and 6 months of his sentence, the old Carlos Marcello would be released into his family's care. Upon his release, he would tell reporters, quote, "I'm retired. I'm happy. Everybody's been nice to me." He would return to his beautiful mansion in Metier overlooking a golf course. Now, he would ultimately live out the rest of his life at 577 Woodvine Avenue. And you can look that place up. Very beautiful home. It's across the street from the Metier Country Club. Now, at one point, he would actually not be able to speak and would ultimately kind of just regress into poorer and poorer health. He would never be seen in public again and would die on March 3rd, 1993. Now, his wife, Jackie, would actually live until 2014, and she would die at the age of 1996. Interestingly enough, the year after Carlos Marcello died, to the day, the widow of John Kennedy, Jackie Kennedy, would actually die as well. So kind of an interesting connection. Now, for the New Orleans Mafia, upon really the incarceration of Carlos Marcello, the family would actually come under the control in 1983 of Joe Marcello Jr., who was the brother of Carlos Marcello. He would ultimately step down in 1990, and for finally, Anthony Carollo would become the boss of the New Orleans Mafia, the guy that all the way back in 1947 was spurned and not given the job. He ended up becoming the boss of the family. Now, in 1994, after a sting involving the FBI, Anthony Carollo would actually be arrested after he tried to infiltrate the Louisiana video poker industry. In September of 1995, he would plead guilty to a single count of racketeering alongside some of his associates. In 2007, Anthony Carollo would die in Slaughter, Louisiana, of natural causes at the age of 83. Today, the New Orleans Mafia is defunct. And really, since 2007, there's really been no mention of the New Orleans crime family. It is really just a distant memory. All the people that were originally involved are now dead. And it's really just a memory now in Louisiana. It's interesting because when we think back in the American Mafia, the families of New York and Chicago and Philly and all these different places will always get all the talk. But the truth is, the Mafia in this country started in New Orleans way back in like 1860. And up until 2007, really about 15 years later, there's no more Mafia in New Orleans. It's completely gone. But when we look back, it was really the antithesis of the Mafia. It would house, in my opinion, the most powerful individual in the history of the Mafia in this country, the most dialed in person who literally controlled the state of Louisiana. He had connections everywhere. He was the godfather of New Orleans criminality. He had been involved with possibly assassinating the president, his brother, civil rights activists. The committee would once call the Senate committee Carlos Marcello the worst criminal in this country. When we look back on the American Mafia, we have to start giving, and again, just in Mafia terms, Carlos Marcello the respect he deserved. He may have been little on the surface, but he was one of the biggest to ever do it. I know this was a long show today, but I hope you enjoyed it. I hope I did the justice of Carlos Marcello. Before we go, I find it important to talk about some of the sources of the information that I got some of this from. Some of it would come from the terrific website, gangstersinc.org. I want to give a shout out to the man, Tom Jones, who wrote the article. Now, I know Tom took a lot of this information from different books about Carlos Marcello, but I wanted to give that website credit. It's a terrific website that I urge all of our listeners to go take a look at. Gangsters Inc. does a great job of really talking about the American Mafia from an historical perspective and a present perspective. As always, please check out our show on Twitter at the Sitdown 7. And as we wrap up the episode today, I do want to tell everybody to make sure you go check us out on YouTube. We are up over 18,000 subscribers, over 2 million views. And I urge you, if you enjoy the show, I think you'll enjoy us on YouTube as well. All you have to do is search The Sitdown, a Mafia history podcast. As always, we'll talk to you next week. We'll go into another great Mafia topic. I hope you're enjoying the show. I know I am. This has been one of my favorite shows to do, and I hope you enjoyed it. We'll see you next week here on The Sitdown.